Sirens pierced the peaceful Georgia night as three of the state's most dangerous prisoners vanished into the darkness. 200 miles away, 93-year-old Margaret Wilson rocked gently on her farmhouse porch, unaware that her peaceful world was about to collide with desperate men. Her grandson Jake, an elite Navy SEAL operator, was halfway around the world when the emergency alert lit up his phone. For 40 years, Margaret had run this farm alone after her husband's passing, facing every challenge with quiet determination. But nothing had prepared her for what was coming. As the escaped convicts moved through the countryside, they searched for the perfect hideout. They thought they'd found it in a secluded farm run by an elderly woman. They were about to learn that some families passed down more than just land. They passed down the warrior spirit that built America. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Wilson's day began like it had for the past 40 years, before the sun. At 93, her movements were slower, but no less purposeful as she made her way down the creaking farmhouse stairs. Her arthritis complained, but Margaret had long ago learned to ignore such protests. The farm didn't run itself. The morning routine was as familiar as breathing. Coffee first, strong enough to stand a spoon in, just like her late husband Thomas had taught her. The ancient percolator sputtered to life, filling the kitchen with the aroma that had started every morning since 1952, when they'd first moved to this land. Through the window, the first hints of dawn painted the Georgia sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold. 200 acres stretched out before her, every inch as familiar as the lines on her weathered hands. The north field needed irrigation attention. She could tell, just by the way the morning mist settled differently there. Thomas had taught her to read the land like this, in the years before cancer took him far too early. "Another day, old friend," she murmured to his photo on the wall, straightening it slightly as she passed. The frame held a younger version of them both. Thomas in his army dress uniform, Margaret in her Sunday best, standing proud before their newly purchased farmhouse. They'd bought the land with his military savings and her inherited determination. Now 4 decades later, she was still here, still farming, still refusing all offers to sell or retire. The screen door creaked its familiar greeting as she stepped onto the porch, her border collie Mac rising from his spot to greet her. "Morning, boy," she said, scratching behind his ears. "Let's check on our guests, shall we?" The chicken coop came first, 36 Rhode Island Reds that provided both eggs for her table and a steady income at the local farmer's market. Margaret counted them automatically, a habit born from years of fox troubles. Next came the 2 dairy cows, Belle and Bessie, their soft lowing a welcome sound in the morning quiet. Her son James called these chores her stubborn ritual during his monthly visits, always suggesting she hire help or move into town. But Margaret knew better. These weren't just chores. They were what kept her alive, kept her moving, kept her independent. Besides, she had promises to keep. "This land stays in the family," Thomas had said on his deathbed, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "Our boy James may have chosen the city, but little Jake, he'll understand someday. He's got the Wilson spirit in him." Jake. Her grandson's latest letter sat unopened on the kitchen table. At 35, he'd already served longer than his grandfather had, though in a very different way. Navy SEALs weren't exactly like the regular army of Thomas's day. The missions Jake couldn't talk about reminded her of the stories Thomas wouldn't tell about Korea. Margaret paused at the barn door, taking a moment to catch her breath. Age might slow her steps, but it hadn't dulled her mind or her resolve. The farm's books, spread out on her kitchen table every Sunday, showed a small but consistent profit. She'd modernized where necessary. The solar panels on the barn roof were her concession to changing times, but kept the soul of the place intact. Inside the barn, she checked the small tractor Thomas had taught her to maintain. Their neighbors had long ago switched to bigger, fancier equipment, but Margaret believed in keeping things simple, fixable. She'd learned every bolt and bearing of this machine, just as she'd learned every fence post and water line of the farm. Morning news played quietly from her portable radio as she worked, more out of habit than interest. But today, something caught her attention, making her pause in her task of checking the feed bins. Continuing coverage of the prison break at Georgia State Penitentiary. 3 inmates remain at large, considered armed and extremely dangerous. Residents in the following counties are advised. Margaret listened carefully, noting the counties mentioned. Her land sat right on the edge of the search area. 40 years of farming had taught her to pay attention to potential threats, whether they came from weather, wildlife, or human nature. Mac's sudden barking drew her attention to the farm's entrance. A sheriff's department vehicle was pulling. Up the long drive, dust rising behind it. Deputy Sarah Chen, whose father had worked this same route when Margaret was young, stepped out with a concerned expression. "Mrs. Wilson," Sarah called out, touching the brim of her hat respectfully. "Thought I'd stop by, given the situation. You been following the news?" "About our unwanted visitors. Just hearing about it now," Margaret replied, patting Mac to quiet him. "Coming in for coffee. Just made a fresh pot." Sarah followed her into the kitchen, both women falling into the comfortable rhythm of long acquaintance. The deputy's eyes scanned the familiar space, the well-worn furniture, the spotless counters, the subtle signs of a life lived with purpose and pride. "You might want to consider staying with your son for a few days," Sarah suggested carefully, knowing even as she said it how the suggestion would be received. "Just until they catch these men." Margaret's response was a soft but firm chuckle. "Honey, I haven't left this farm for more than a day since Thomas passed. Not about to start now because of some jailbirds who probably don't even know my farm exists." Sarah sighed, having expected this answer. "At least let me have a car drive by more often. These aren't ordinary criminals, Mrs. Wilson. The ringleader, Victor Ramirez, he's got a history of violence that would curl your hair." "Thank you, dear," Margaret said, refilling Sarah's coffee cup. "But Mac and I will be just fine, though I wouldn't say no to you showing me how to check if that old shotgun of Thomas's still works properly." Lieutenant Jake Wilson sat in the cramped communications room of a naval base in undisclosed location, staring at his grandmother's latest letter. Even here, thousands of miles from Georgia, he could smell the lingering scent of her kitchen that always seemed to permeate her correspondence. The paper was her usual type, torn carefully from one of the notebooks she kept by her rocking chair. "Dear Jake," it began in her precise handwriting, "the North fields yielding better than expected this year. Your grandfather always said that soil just needed patience, and I suppose 40 years of care finally proved him right. Mac's been chasing foxes again, though his bark is more enthusiastic than his legs these days. Rather like his owner, I suppose." Jake smiled, reading between the lines. His grandmother never complained, but he knew maintaining the farm alone at her age was a constant challenge. His father, James, ever practical, had been suggesting assisted living for years. Jake understood, both sides, the need for practicality and the pull of legacy. "Wilson," a voice called from the doorway. "Satellite call from home base. Sounds urgent." Jake carefully folded the letter into his pocket. 12 years in the SEALs had taught him that urgent usually meant trouble. He wasn't wrong. "Lieutenant Wilson," his commanding officer's voice crackled through the secure line. "We're cutting your deployment short. Family emergency protocol activated." Jake's heart rate spiked. In 12 years of service, through firefights and classified operations, he'd never used the family emergency protocol. "Sir?" "Prison break. In your home region. 3 highly dangerous individuals. Intel suggests they're moving through areas, including your grandmother's property sector. Given your unique situation and accumulated leave time, we're green-lighting your return." The commander didn't need to say more. Jake's situation was indeed unique. a Navy SEAL with counter-terrorism training and a potentially vulnerable family member in a crisis zone. The military took care of its own. As Jake packed his gear, memories flooded back. Summer afternoons learning to shoot from his grandfather, using that old Winchester that still hung above the kitchen door. Margaret teaching him to read the weather, to understand the land's rhythms. His grandfather's stories of career told in that quiet voice he only used for important lessons. "A farm's not just land, boy," Thomas had said once, showing young Jake how to mend a fence. "It's a responsibility. To the soil, to the family, to the future. You understand that better than your father ever did?" It was true. While James had chosen the city life, Jake had always felt the farm's pull. Even in the SEALs, he'd used lessons learned there. Patience, observation, the ability to read terrain and weather. His grandmother had taught him to notice details, how birds behaved before a storm, how the wind changed before rain. Those same observation skills had saved his team's lives more than once. On the long flight home, Jake reviewed what he knew. Victor Ramirez, the escape's mastermind, had a history of extreme violence. His two companions were equally dangerous. A former Special Forces operator turned mercenary and a local criminal known for his knowledge of the region's back roads. Jake's tablet displayed satellite images of the farm and surrounding area. He'd studied them often enough, marking the changes over years of visits. The old barn's new solar panels, the irrigation system his grandmother had finally agreed to modernize. The security cameras he'd quietly installed during his last leave, linked to his phone. Those cameras showed him the farm was currently quiet. Margaret moved through her daily routine, seemingly unconcerned about potential threats. But Jake knew her better. The subtle changes in her pattern, keeping Mac closer, checking the locks more often, told him she was aware and alert. His team would be worried. They'd seen the footage of his marksmanship training, conducted on the farm's back 40 with his grandfather's old rifle. "Your grandmother teach you to shoot like that?" They'd joke. They didn't know how close to the truth they were. Margaret had indeed refined his shooting, teaching him the patience his grandfather had taught her. "Breathe with the land," she'd say, watching him practice. "A farm works on nature's rhythm. So should you." A text message lit up his phone. His father. "Called Mom again. She's being stubborn, won't leave the farm. Maybe you can talk sense into her when you get back." Jake didn't respond. He knew better than anyone that Margaret Wilson didn't need sense talked into her. She needed support, protection, and understanding. The farm wasn't just her home, it was her life's work. Her connection to Thomas, her daily purpose. His military training kicked in, automatically assessing resources and vulnerabilities. The farm's layout offered both challenges and advantages. The long driveway provided clear lines of sight. The old barn's height would make an excellent observation. And post, the creek that ran along the eastern border could be both an asset and a liability. "Sir?" The flight attendant's voice broke into his planning. "We're beginning our descent into Atlanta." Jake nodded, closing his tablet. In less than 2 hours he'd be at the farm. His grandmother had protected that land for 40 years. Now it was his turn to protect her. The last time he'd deployed, she'd hugged him and said something that only now revealed its full meaning. "Don't worry about me, Jake. Wilson farmers are harder to break than most folks think." He was about to find out just how true that was. Margaret noticed the changes before anyone else did. 20 years of watching hawks hunt over her fields had taught her their patterns. Now they were circling differently, agitated by something in the tree line. Mac felt it too, his usual lazy afternoon patrols becoming more focused, his ears perking at sounds only he could hear. The local news had been running constant updates about the escapees. But it was the subtle shifts that concerned Margaret more. Betty from the general store mentioned strangers asking questions about local farms. The usual morning traffic on the county road had thinned, as if people were avoiding the area. "Just being cautious," Sarah Chen had said during her third patrol past the farm that day. But Margaret saw the deputy's hand resting closer to her weapon, noticed how she scanned the tree lines while they talked. That evening, as Margaret worked on her accounts at the kitchen table, Mac suddenly growled, a low, serious sound she hadn't heard since the coyote incident last spring. Through the window, she caught movement at the edge of her property, a flash of dark clothing quickly disappearing into the shadows. She reached for the phone, then stopped. The figure had moved with purpose, knowing where the security camera blind spots were. Someone had been watching her farm, learning its patterns. Margaret rose slowly, her joints protesting the sudden movement. She moved to the living room, where Thomas's old shotgun hung above the fireplace. Sarah had helped her clean and load it yesterday, though they both had hoped it wouldn't be needed. Mac's growling intensified. Through the kitchen window, Margaret saw more movement, this time by the old tractor shed. Someone was testing her. Defenses watching for reactions, her cell phone buzzed, Jake's special ringtone. She answered quietly, keeping her eyes on the windows. "Grandma." His voice was tense. "The security cameras just picked up movement. Are you okay?" "Just some evening visitors," Margaret replied calmly, though her hand tightened on the shotgun. "Nothing Mac and I can't handle. I'm 3 hours out." Jake's voice held controlled urgency. "Deputy Chen is 5 minutes away. Stay inside. Stay armed." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. "Don't worry about me, dear. Your grandfather didn't marry a wilting flower." As if punctuating her words, Mac's barking suddenly turned fierce. Through the gathering dusk, Margaret saw what had agitated him. A beam from a flashlight, quickly extinguished, near the barn. They were getting bolder. Thunder rumbled in the distance as storm clouds gathered over the farm. Margaret Wilson stood. In her darkening kitchen, Thomas's shotgun ready, watching shadows move across her land. The intruders thought they were hunting an easy target. They were about to learn otherwise. The storm broke just before midnight, rain drumming against the farmhouse windows. Margaret sat in the darkness of her kitchen, Thomas's shotgun across her lap, Mac alert at her feet. The security camera feed showed on her tablet. Jake had talked her through accessing it during their last call. The first real confrontation came with a knock at her door. "Ma'am?" A voice called out, strained with false politeness. "Car broke down up the road. Need to use your phone." Margaret stayed silent. Through the security feed, she could see 3 figures on her porch, 1 at her door, 2 hanging back in the shadows. Their prison jumpsuits had been replaced with stolen clothes, but their predatory movements betrayed them. "We know you're in there," the voice hardened. "Lights were on earlier. Be smart about this." Mac's growl deepened. Margaret placed a calming hand on his head, mind racing through options. Deputy Chen was handling another emergency call 20 minutes away. Jake was still 2 hours out. The nearest neighbor was half a mile down the road. Thunder cracked overhead. As rain intensified, through the window, Margaret caught a glimpse of Victor Ramirez's face in a lightning flash. Handsome in a cruel way, with eyes that reminded her of the rabid wolf Thomas had once had to put down. Last chance to do this. "Easy," Ramirez called out. "We're coming in either way." Margaret's finger found the shotgun's trigger. "I've got a loaded 12-gauge that says otherwise." She projected her voice clearly, the way Thomas had taught her. "And a very unfriendly dog." Laughter from the porch, but with an edge to it. They hadn't expected resistance. "Listen, Grandma." Ramirez's voice turned silky. "We just need a place to lay low. Play nice. We'll be gone by morning. Fight us. Things get unpleasant." "I've got Deputy Chen on speed dial," Margaret replied calmly. "And my grandson's security cameras are streaming everything to his phone. He's former Special Forces, by the way, very protective of his grandmother." A pause. Margaret watched the tablet as the three men conferred. The mention of cameras had rattled them, but she saw Ramirez gesture toward the barn. They were planning something. Her cell phone vibrated. "Jake," she answered without taking her eyes off the door. "Got a response team en route." He spoke quickly. 90 minutes out. Deputy Chen's redirecting. "How many?" "3, Margaret kept, her voice steady. Their glass shattered in her living room. They'd split up, 2 at the front while the third circled around. Mac launched himself toward the sound, barking furiously. "Grandma!" Jake's voice sharpened. "Get to the basement! The gun's safe!" The line went dead as the storm knocked out cell service. Through the kitchen door, Margaret saw flashlight beams sweeping her living room. Mac's barking turned to a yelp of pain. "No!" The word escaped her before she could stop it. Rage replaced fear. They'd hurt her dog. Margaret Wilson had survived 40 years of storms, droughts, and disasters. She'd held this farm together through her husband's death, through market crashes, through everything nature and man had thrown at her. She wasn't about to let 3 escaped convicts take it all away. The basement door was 3 steps away. Inside, Jake had installed a gun safe with modern weapons, but Margaret knew she'd never reach it in time. Instead, she did what farmers had done since the beginning of time. She adapted. The kitchen's back door opened silently. She kept all her hinges well oiled. As boot prints tracked mud across her clean floors, Margaret slipped out into the rain. The storm would cover her movement. More importantly, it would cover what she was about to do. From the barn's hidden equipment room, she retrieved the flare gun from the emergency kit. Jake had insisted on upgrading her safety equipment during his last visit. "Signal for help," he'd said. Margaret had a different use in mind. She pointed it at the hay storage in the old barn and fired. The flash and subsequent fire were immediate. Dry hay caught quickly, sending smoke and flames into the stormy sky. Almost instantly, she heard shouting from the house. Emergency vehicles would be coming. Fire meant attention, exactly what escaped prisoners didn't want. Margaret used the distraction to circle back to the house through the rain. Mac's barking had resumed, injured but alive. Through the window, she saw the convicts arguing, Ramirez gesturing angrily at the burning barn. Then her phone buzzed again. Deputy Chen this time. "Incoming, 2 minutes, fire department right behind. You okay?" "Tell them to hurry," Margaret whispered, "but have them come in quiet. No sirens." She explained her plan quickly. The convicts were too focused on the fire to notice the first police cruiser arriving silently through the rain, or the second, or the third. By the time they realized they were surrounded, it was too late. "Police down on the ground!" Margaret watched through her window as her unwelcome visitors were taken into custody. Their brief reign of terror ended by an old woman's quick thinking and a strategically placed flare. She found Mac in the living room, limping but defiant. "Good boy," she whispered, checking his injury. Bruised but not broken, her phone came back to life. "Grandma!" Jake's voice was desperate. "What's happening? The cameras!" "Everything's fine, dear," Margaret said, watching Deputy Chen oversee the prisoners' transport. "Though I'm afraid you'll need to help me rebuild the barn again. Seems fire is becoming our family's go-to solution for unwanted guests." She could almost hear Jake's relief-filled smile. "I'm still coming." "Of course you are," Margaret settled into her rocking chair, Mac at her feet. "And this time, you're going to help me install better security cameras. Seems this old farm needs to learn some new tricks." Outside, the storm began to fade, and with it the last traces of fire. Margaret Wilson had protected her home just as she had for 40 years. But as she watched the police cars leave, she knew this wasn't over. Men like Ramirez didn't forget or forgive. She was glad Jake was coming home. Jake Wilson's rental car ate up the dark Georgia miles as rain continued to fall. His SEAL training kept him alert despite 36 hours without sleep, his mind processing every detail from the fragmented reports he'd received. The barn fire, the confrontation, His grandmother's ingenious but dangerous solution. The farm's security cameras were back online after the storm, feeding directly to his tablet mounted on the dashboard. He watched Margaret moving through the house, seemingly calm as she tended to Mac's injuries, but Jake knew her tells, the slightly stiffer posture, the more frequent glances at windows. She was rattled, even if she'd never admit it. His phone rang through the car's Bluetooth. Lieutenant Wilson, Sheriff Monica Hayes. Just finished interviewing Ramirez. Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel. What's his play? Man's not talking much, but his body language when we mentioned your grandmother's farm. Jake, I've worked prisoner transport for 15 years. I know that look. He's not done. Expected as much, Jake replied, scanning the dark roadside. His background file suggests a pattern of calculated revenge. What about his associates? The ex-military one, Carson, he's staying quiet too. But the local guy, Peters, he's nervous. Keeps asking about protective custody. Jake processed this. Peters would be the weak link, but also the one with local knowledge. Any signs of outside help? Their escape was too well planned for just 3 people. Working that angle, Hayes confirmed. Your grandmother okay? Deputy Chen says she handled herself like a pro. A ghost of a smile crossed Jake's face. Wilsons are harder to break than most folks think. The call ended as Jake turned onto the familiar dirt road leading to the farm. His tactical training kicked in automatically, noting changes since his last visit. The recent rain would make the eastern approach too muddy for vehicles. The burned barn removed one potential shelter, but also created a blind spot in their security and coverage. Margaret was waiting on the porch, Mac alert beside her despite his bandaged leg. Jake's trained eye caught the shotgun just inside the doorframe, within easy reach. Some habits died hard. You didn't need to come all this way, Margaret said as he climbed the steps, but her tight hug betrayed her words. Yes, I did. Jake held her for a moment, cataloguing details. She'd lost weight since his last visit. The hands that had taught him to plant and harvest now felt more fragile, though their grip remained strong. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and gun oil. The living room window had been temporarily repaired with plywood, and Jake noted the new position of the furniture, better defensive coverage of entry points. His grandmother had been busy. Mac took a hit protecting me, Margaret said, scratching the border collie's ears. Reminded me of that time your grandfather's old dog ranger faced down that rabid fox. Jake checked Mac's injury with gentle hands. Clean bandaging. Deputy Chen's work. Sarah's been checking in every hour. Sweet girl. Worried too much. Margaret poured coffee into his grandfather's old Marine Corps mug. Like someone else I know, Jake accepted the coffee but didn't smile. They'll try again. I know. Margaret settled into her rocking chair, watching him with clear eyes. Ramirez, the leader, he has the same look that Wolf had, the one your grandfather had to put down, won't stop until someone stops him. Moving to the window, Jake studied the farm's layout through rain-streaked glass. The property had natural, defensive advantages, good sight lines, elevated ground at the house, multiple fallback positions. But it also had vulnerabilities that needed addressing. Their first attempt was rushed, he analyzed. Desperate men making desperate choices. Next time will be different, planned, coordinated. Then we'll plan better, Margaret said simply. She reached for a worn leather folder on the side table. Your grandfather's old property maps shows everything. Water lines, power conduits, all the improvements we made over 40 years. Jake spread the maps on the kitchen table, his tactical mind already adapting farm features for defense. The old irrigation ditches could be obstacles. The elevated pump house would make an excellent observation post. Peters will talk eventually, he mused. When he does, Ramirez's outside help will need to move fast. They've lost the element of surprise, but gained local knowledge of the property. Jake. Margaret's voice drew his attention from the maps. This is still a working farm. Whatever plans you're making need to account for that. I've got crops that need tending, animals that need care." He nodded, understanding the subtext. His grandmother wouldn't abandon her life's work, wouldn't be driven from her home by fear. The farm needed defending, but it also needed to keep functioning. A quiet bark from Mac signaled Deputy Chen's arrival, right on schedule. Jake watched through the window as she executed a perfect perimeter check before approaching the house. Sarah had learned well from her father, who'd been the responding officer the night Jake's grandfather passed. "Got some news," Sarah said as she entered, nodding to Jake. Peters started talking. "Claims Ramirez has connections, former associates from his time in the drug trade. Says they're prepping for something big." Jake's expression hardened. "Timeline? Soon. Maybe days, maybe hours. Rain's supposed to clear by morning." Margaret rose from her chair, her movement drawing both younger people's attention. In the lamplight, she looked both fragile and formidable, 93 years of strength wrapped in a deceptively delicate frame. "Well then," she said, touching Thomas's photo on the wall. "Best we get ready. Jake, your grandfather kept some. Things in the root cellar you might find useful. Sarah, dear, I'll need your help moving the cattle to the lower pasture, and someone needs to make a fresh pot of coffee. Something tells me it's going to be a long night." Jake watched his grandmother begin preparations with the same methodical efficiency she'd always shown during harvest or storm seasons. Crisis or not, she was still a farmer first. The thought sparked an idea. "They'll expect us to fortify," he said slowly, "to turn the farm into a fortress. But what if we do something different, something they won't expect?" Margaret paused, a knowing look crossing her face. "You have that same expression your grandfather had before he'd figured out a particularly clever solution." Jake smiled grimly. "They think they're dealing with a helpless old woman and a military-trained grandson. Let's show them what they're really facing. A farmer who spent 40 years learning every inch of this land, and a SEAL who knows how to use that knowledge." Outside, the rain finally began to ease, revealing a sky turning pink with approaching dawn. The storm was passing, but Jake Wilson knew the real tempest was yet to come. Dawn painted the farm in shades of gold as Margaret Wilson walked her property lines with Jake, Mac limping faithfully behind them. To anyone watching, it would have looked like a grandmother showing her grandson the morning's farm work. In reality, it was a tactical assessment disguised as a farming routine. "Irrigation channel here," Margaret pointed, using her walking stick to indicate the deep furrow. "Your grandfather expanded it 3 feet wide after the flood of '85, deep enough to trap a vehicle if someone doesn't know it's there." Jake noted the location on his tablet, overlaying tactical markers on the farm's layout. "Natural channeling point forces them to use the main approach or risk getting bogged down." "Assuming it rains again," Margaret added. "Weather radios, calling for storms tonight. Thomas always said weather was the best ally a farmer could have." They moved to the burned barn next. The structure's skeleton remained largely intact, thanks to the metal framework Thomas had insisted on decades ago. Margaret ran her hand along a scorched support beam. "Shame about the hay storage," she said practically, "but the foundations solid. Your grandfather built this place to last." Jake studied the ruins with a different eye. Elevated position, clear lines of sight to both access roads. "We can use this." "Already thought of that," Margaret smiled slightly. "Why do you think I aim for the hayloft? Cleared our firing lines." Jake looked at his grandmother with newfound appreciation. She'd been thinking tactically, even in the heat of the moment. Their circuit brought them to the root cellar. Margaret produced an old key from her pocket. "Thomas's special storage. Haven't opened this since he passed." The heavy door creaked open, revealing not just preserved foods, but a carefully maintained cache of equipment. Military-grade gear, maintained despite decades of storage. Jake recognized some pieces from his grandfather's service days. Others More recent. Your grandfather believed in being prepared, Margaret explained, watching Jake examine a tactical vest. After Korea, he said he'd never be caught unprepared again. Each Christmas, he'd add something new, called it his insurance policy. This is quality gear, Jake mused, checking the seals on boxes of ammunition, and well maintained. Every month, same as the tractor maintenance. A farm runs on routine, Thomas always said, even the parts you hope you'll never need. They emerged into strengthening sunlight. Farm work wouldn't wait, even with threats looming. Margaret headed to the chicken coop, while Jake began installing new security cameras to replace those damaged in the storm. Deputy Chen's patrol car appeared right on schedule. She stepped out, carrying fresh reports. Peters gave up more details. Ramirez's outside contact is a former cartel enforcer. They're gathering manpower at a location about 2 hours from here. Timeline? Jake asked, not pausing in his work. Soon. They're waiting for something, but Peters doesn't know what. Margaret emerged from the coop with a basket of eggs. Weather? Most likely. Tonight's storm would provide good cover. It's what I would choose if I were them. Both Jake and Sarah looked at her with surprise. She shrugged. 40 years of farming teaches you to think like your opponents, whether they're weather patterns, crop diseases, or unwanted visitors. Jake's tablet chimed. Motion alerts from his new security grid. Vehicle approaching. Unmarked van. 2 occupants. Sarah checked her radio. Not one of ours. Probably reconnaissance, Jake analyzed. Testing our awareness, response time. Margaret handed her egg basket to Sarah. Well then, let's give them something to think about. She started toward the house with purpose. Grandma, Jake's tone held warning. Trust me, dear, sometimes the best defense is making your opponent question their assumptions. They watched as Margaret settled into her rocking chair on the porch, the picture of elderly contentment. As the van slowed past the farm's entrance, she began cleaning Thomas's shotgun, her movements unhurried but precise. The van accelerated. Quickly. Psychological warfare, Jake said with grudging admiration. Letting them know their easy target is anything but. A scarecrow only works if the crows believe it has teeth, Margaret replied calmly, checking the shotgun's action with practiced ease. Sarah's radio crackled. The van's plate had been logged, registered to a known associate of Ramirez's cartel connections. The pieces were falling into place. Throughout the day, they maintained the farm's routine. Margaret tended her animals and crops. Jake installed defensive measures disguised as routine maintenance. Sarah's patrols became more frequent as storm clouds began gathering on the horizon. By dusk, the first thunder rumbled in the distance. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching lightning illuminate the gathering darkness. They'll come tonight, she said with quiet certainty. Jake nodded, checking his equipment one final time. We're ready. Margaret reached out to touch his arm. Jake, remember what Thomas always said about farming in storm season? Don't fight. The weather, Jake quoted. Use it. Exactly. Margaret's eyes held the same steely determination he remembered from childhood storms and harvest emergencies. They think the storm is their ally. Let's show them how wrong they are. Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying the promise of rain. On the kitchen table, their preparations were laid out like harvest plans, maps, equipment, contingencies. But these weren't for growing crops. They were for protecting what generations of Wilsons had built, what Margaret had preserved through 40 years of challenges. Not just land and buildings, but something more fundamental, the right to live. Without fear on one's own soil, the storm was coming, but the farm was ready. As darkness fell, Margaret sat at her kitchen table cleaning her husband's old service pistol. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, muscle memory unchanged since Thomas first taught her 40 years ago. Jake watched from the doorway, struck by how the simple act embodied everything about his grandmother. Careful, methodical, refusing to let age diminish her capabilities. Your grandfather used to stand exactly there, Margaret said without looking up. Watching, worried, every time. Storm season came around. Had to remind him I'd been handling things long before he got sick. He knew you could handle it. Jake moved to help her reassemble the weapon. Just like I do. Doesn't stop us from worrying. Thunder cracked overhead as Margaret tested the pistol's action. Worry's natural, fear's a choice. Thomas taught me that after his first heart attack, said I had two options. Live in fear of what might happen or prepare for what could happen. Through the window, lightning illuminated the farm's familiar shapes, now transformed by Jake's defensive preparations. The burned barn had become an observation post. The irrigation ditches were ready to become trenches. Even Mac's doghouse concealed surveillance equipment. Found something in Thomas's papers. Margaret reached for a worn envelope. Think it's time you had it. Inside was a single photograph. Thomas, in his army dress uniform, receiving a commendation Jake had never seen mentioned in official records. Special operations, Margaret explained. Before they had fancy names for it. He never talked about it, but he kept his skills sharp. Said some duties don't end with discharge. Jake studied the photo, seeing his grandfather in a new light. That's why he trained me the way he did. The shooting, the tactics. He saw something in you. Same thing I see now. Margaret stood, her movement still graceful despite her years. A Wilson protects what matters, not just land and crops, but principles. What's right? The storm intensified, rain drumming against the roof. Sarah's patrol car pulled up, headlights cutting through the darkness. Their time for preparation was ending. Ready? Jake asked, knowing the answer. Margaret checked her pistol one final time before sliding it into the custom holster Jake had noticed her wearing under her farming jacket. Born ready, she replied, sounding so much like Thomas that Jake had to smile. Let's show them what happens when they threaten a Wilson farm. Outside, the storm raged, nature's fury matching their resolve. The farm had faced threats before, weather, economics, time itself. But tonight's challenge would test not just their preparations, but their legacy. A legacy built by Thomas Wilson's military precision and Margaret's farming wisdom, now defended by their grandson's modern tactical expertise and his grandmother's timeless strength. The storm was their ally now, and like true farmers, they would use every tool at their disposal to protect what was theirs. The storm's brief lull allowed Jake and Margaret to make one final inspection of the farm's defenses. What Jake discovered changed his entire tactical approach. Each seemingly innocent farming feature concealed deadly potential. Your grandfather designed these storage tunnels in '75, Margaret explained, leading Jake through a hidden network beneath the farm. Connected the root cellar to every major building. Said it was for moving supplies during winter storms. Jake's tactical light revealed well-maintained passages, reinforced with military precision. These aren't just storage tunnels, they're defensive positions. Thomas called them his contingency routes. Margaret smiled slightly. Every fall we'd check them together. Part of the harvest preparation, he'd say. Though I noticed he paid more attention to lines of sight than crop storage. The tunnel network was a masterpiece of defensive engineering disguised as agricultural infrastructure. Ventilation shafts doubled as observation posts. Water drainage systems could be converted into anti-vehicle trenches. Even the old grain silo had been modified with concealed firing ports. All these years, Jake mused, I thought Grandpa was just being thorough with farm maintenance. Your grandfather believed in layers, Margaret replied, showing him a hidden cache of equipment. Layers of crops to protect the soil, he'd say, but he meant other layers too. Protection, security, defense. They emerged near the damaged barn, where Sarah Chen waited with fresh intelligence. Sheriff's office just intercepted some chatter. Ramirez's people are mobilizing, at least 12 men, military-grade hardware. Jake processed this while studying. the farm's layout with new understanding. They'll expect us to concentrate on defending the house. Standard protection detail for a vulnerable target. But that's not what we're doing, is it? Margaret's eyes held a glint of her husband's tactical wisdom. We're defending a farm, and farms have their own rules. Jake nodded, his SEAL training, merging with childhood lessons about the land. A farm is a system, everything connected, everything serving multiple purposes. Exactly, Margaret pointed to the north field. That irrigation channel your grandfather insisted on widening. Notice how it channels everything toward the lower pasture? Jake saw it now. Perfect kill zone. And those new solar panels you installed last year, they're positioned to create blind spots in night vision equipment. Thomas always said good farming is about using what you have. Margaret moved with renewed energy. Sun, rain, soil, everything's a tool if you know how to use it. Sarah studied the farm with growing appreciation. You've been maintaining a tactical defense system disguised as a working farm for 40 years. I've been farming, Margaret corrected, just the way Thomas taught me. If those methods happen to serve other purposes, she shrugged. A good farmer wastes nothing. The radio crackled. Another update. 2 vehicles spotted on back roads approaching the county. The storm's next wave was rolling in, bringing darkness and driving rain. Inside the farmhouse they made final adjustments to their plans. Jake's modern tactical overlays merged with his grandfather's hand-drawn maps, creating a defense strategy that spanned generations. Weather Service confirms, Sarah reported. Major system moving in, 0 visibility. Conditions within the hour. Perfect, Margaret said, checking Thomas's old barometer. Harvest weather. Jake looked up sharply. Harvest weather? Mm-hmm. Margaret's smile held decades of farming wisdom. When a storm this big rolls in during harvest, you can't fight it. You have to work with it, use its patterns. Your grandfather taught me that the year before you were born. Understanding dawned in Jake's eyes. We're not just defending against an attack, we're bringing in a harvest, Margaret finished. Just not the kind they're expecting. Lightning flashed, illuminating the farm's innocent-looking features, each one now revealed as part of an intricate defensive web. The irrigation pipes that could become improvised water cannons, the tractor paths that concealed tank traps, the scattered hay bales positioned for optimal cover. Thomas Wilson, Jake said softly, you magnificent paranoid genius. Not paranoid, Margaret corrected, checking her husband's pistol one final time. Prepared. He used to say that farming and fighting had a lot in common. Success in both depends on preparation, timing, and using the environment to your advantage. They gathered their equipment as the storm intensified. Sarah's radio brought reports of more vehicles moving into position. The enemy was coming, drawn by the promise of easy vengeance against an elderly woman and her soldier grandson. They had no idea they were walking into 40 years of tactical preparation disguised as routine farm maintenance. One last thing, Margaret said, opening a hidden panel in the kitchen wall. Inside was a state-of-the-art communications center. Early wedding present from Thomas. Said a farmer should always be able to call for help. Jake stared at the equipment, recognizing military-grade technology, somehow kept updated through the decades. Grandma, just how many secrets does this farm have? Margaret's eyes twinkled. Enough to keep things interesting. Now, shall we show them how the Wilson family brings in a harvest? Outside, the storm raged, nature itself seeming to align with their defense. Soon, Ramirez and his men would learn what Jake was just discovering, that the most dangerous ground is the kind that looks harmless until it's too late. The farm was more than just his grandmother's home. It was a fortress hidden in plain sight, crafted by a veteran's tactical genius and maintained by a farmer's patient dedication, and it was about to become a very dangerous place to be. The first sign of trouble came through the farm's vibration sensors, disguised as irrigation monitors in the north field. Jake watched the tactical display as 3 vehicles approached through the storm, their lights off, moving with military precision. Right on schedule, Margaret said, watching the same feed from Thomas's hidden command center. They're using the old logging road, just like your grandfather predicted they would. Makes sense, Jake replied, adjusting the camera feeds. High ground, natural cover seems like the smart approach. His smile was grim. Unless you know about the drainage system modifications we made this afternoon. On cue, Sarah's voice crackled. Through their secure channel. Rains overwhelmed the North Culvert, just like you said it would. Logging roads turned into a mudslide. Through the cameras they watched the lead vehicle struggle, its wheels spinning uselessly in the precisely engineered quagmire. The other vehicles attempted to reverse, only to find the road had become a trap. First rule of farming, Margaret quoted, checking Thomas's old weather gauges. Water always wins. The storm intensified, rain drumming against the reinforced windows. Lightning revealed brief glimpses of armed men abandoning their vehicles, forced to proceed on foot. They moved like professionals, maintaining proper intervals, but their formation was already compromised. They're splitting into 3 teams, Jake analyzed. 2 to flank, 1 up the middle, standard tactical approach. Margaret adjusted one of Thomas's old monitors. Notice they're using the tree line for cover, walking right into the old pasture drainage system. Jake watched as the flanking teams disappeared into the darkness, seconds later cursing, crackled through their surveillance equipment as the attackers discovered the flooded drainage ditches. Your grandfather redesigned those ditches in '82, Margaret explained, said it was for better erosion control. Never mentioned they could channel stormwater into instant obstacles. The attackers regrouped, but their coordinated approach was already disrupted. Through the infrared cameras, Jake counted 12 men, all armed with military-grade weapons. They looked professional, dangerous, and increasingly frustrated. Getting something on the long-range mics, Sarah reported. They're calling for backup. 2 more vehicles en route. Good, Jake said softly. More hardware to get stuck in Grandpa's. Tactical mud pits. Margaret moved to the main storage room, retrieving something from a locked cabinet. Think it's time we introduced ourselves properly. Grandma? Don't worry, she held up what looked like a simple farm flare. Your grandfather modified these years ago, non-lethal but very effective at disrupting night vision equipment. Before Jake could respond, she pressed a button on the command console. Across the farm, hidden speakers crackled to life, carrying her voice through the storm. Attention, trespassers. Her tone was calm, almost conversational. In case you're wondering, those ditches you're standing in are about to get 3 feet deeper. Storm runoff from the north field hits in about 30 seconds. I'd suggest moving to higher ground. The infrared feed showed the attackers scrambling, their formation completely broken. Right on cue, the collected stormwater crashed through the farm's intricate drainage system, turning planned routes of approach into miniature rivers. Got to admire Thomas's engineering, Margaret mused, watching the chaos. 40 years of drainage. Improvements, every one of them designed to flood specific areas on command. Jake shook his head in amazement. All these years, I thought Grandpa was just obsessed with water management. Oh, he was, Margaret smiled, just not only for farming. The radio crackled again. Backup vehicles had arrived, only to find themselves stuck on roads that had mysteriously turned to mud. The storm's intensity seemed to increase with each failed approach, as if nature itself was allied with the farm's defenders. Through it all, Margaret Wilson calmly monitored her husband's systems, adjusting water flow and drainage patterns with the same precision she used for crop irrigation. To her, this was just another kind of harvest, one where the farm itself was their most powerful ally. They'll try the barn next, Jake predicted, watching the attackers regroup again. High ground, good cover from the storm. Most likely, Margaret agreed. Good thing we prepared a proper welcome. As if on cue, the burned barn's remaining structure creaked ominously in the wind. The attackers wouldn't know about the carefully weakened support beams or the precisely calculated collapse zones. Sometimes, Margaret thought, the best defense wasn't in what you built, but in what you let fall, as long as it fell exactly where and when you wanted it to. The storm raged on, but inside their command center, grandmother and grandson waited patiently. Like true farmers, they knew that sometimes the best strategy was to let nature do the work for you, and nature was just getting started. In the brief calm between storm waves, Margaret made coffee using Thomas's old percolator. The familiar ritual seemed oddly normal against the tactical displays showing armed men struggling across their property. Your grandfather and I spent our first night on this farm during a storm like this, she said, handing Jake a steaming cup. No electricity, no running water yet. Just us, this coffee pot, and his absolute certainty that this land was worth every penny. Jake accepted the coffee, watching another group of attackers stumble into one of his grandfather's hidden defensive features. He built all this while running a working farm. Must have taken years. Little by little. A drainage ditch here, a reinforced wall there. Margaret checked one of the hidden monitors. He called it his retirement project, said every farmer needed a hobby. A massive lightning strike illuminated the farm, revealing glimpses of frustrated attackers regrouping. Near the collapsed barn, their professional formation had devolved into scattered groups, each one stymied by seemingly natural obstacles that were anything but natural. They're adapting, Jake noted, starting to realize this isn't just bad luck or weather. Of course they are, Margaret replied calmly. That's what your grandfather counted on. He always said the best trap isn't the first one you set. It's the third or fourth. The ones they spring after they think they've figured out your pattern. Sarah's voice crackled through their radio. Movement at the south edge. They're bringing in heavier equipment. Looks like professional gear. Through the cameras, they watched a tactical team setting up what looked like advanced surveillance equipment. Margaret's response was to reach for a very ordinary-looking irrigation control panel. Southfield's due for its midnight watering. Cycle, isn't it? She asked innocently. Jake smiled, understanding. Amazing how those new sprinklers seem to interfere with electronic equipment. Thomas was very particular about proper irrigation coverage, Margaret said, as she activated the system. On their monitors, the tactical team's expensive equipment suddenly sparked and died, soaked by precisely aimed water jets. A comfortable silence fell, grandmother and grandson watching their defenses work exactly as Thomas had planned. Finally, Margaret spoke softly. He would have been proud, you know, seeing you use his systems, understanding what he built here. I never knew, Jake admitted. All those summers he spent teaching me about the farm. He was teaching me tactical defense, and I didn't even realize it. That's exactly what he wanted. Said the best lessons are the ones you don't know you're learning until you need them. Margaret touched the old photo of Thomas. A farm protects its own, he always said, and so do Wilson's. The storm's intensity grew again, but inside their command center, surrounded by Thomas's legacy of protection, grandmother and grandson stood. Ready? They were more than just defenders of land now. They were custodians of a heritage built on love, sacrifice, and the unshakable bond of family. Outside, the attackers were about to discover just how deep that bond ran. The revelation came through Sarah Chen's radio, her voice tight with controlled anger. Jake, we've got a problem. Just found out who's been feeding them information about the farm's layout. It's James. Margaret's hands stilled on the coffee. Pot Jake's father, her son. Confirmed, Sarah continued. County surveillance caught him meeting with Ramirez's contacts 3 days ago. He's been sharing details about the property, access points, your grandmother's routines. Jake watched his grandmother absorb this news, seeing the hurt flash across her face before being replaced by something harder. The development offers, Margaret said quietly. They weren't random, were they? No, Sarah confirmed. James has been working with a real estate group connected to Ramirez's organization. They've been trying to force sales across the county. Your farm was the key property they needed. The betrayal crystallized in Jake's mind. His father's increasing pressure for Margaret to sell the farm, his sudden interest in property values, his persistent attempts to convince her to move into assisted living. It hadn't been concern driving those suggestions. He never understood. Margaret said, moving to Thomas's photo on the wall. The farm wasn't just land to your grandfather. It was a promise, a legacy. Her voice hardened, and now James is helping criminals take it. The tactical displays showed the attackers regrouping, their movements now more purposeful. Through their surveillance system, they caught fragments of radio traffic. West entrance clear, irrigation system bypassed, backup power targets marked. They were using insider knowledge, defeating Thomas's defenses through information. Only a family member would know. They know about the tunnels, Jake realized. The backup systems, the security upgrades, everything I told Dad during our weekly calls. Margaret's expression shifted from hurt to resolve. But they don't know everything. She moved to the command center's far wall, pressing what looked like an ordinary light switch. A hidden panel slid open. Your grandfather kept some secrets, even from family. Inside was a detailed map of systems James knew nothing about. Defensive measures Thomas had installed in absolute secrecy, documented only in a journal Margaret had kept hidden since his death. Thomas always said, Margaret's voice carried decades of farming wisdom, that you never plant all your seeds in one field, always keep something in reserve. For emergencies. Through their cameras, they watched the attackers begin implementing their insider knowledge, confidently moving through what they thought were all of the farm's defenses. Let them think they know everything, Margaret said, her fingers moving across Thomas's hidden control panel. Sometimes the best crop is the one nobody knows you planted. Sarah's voice crackled through their radio again. James is on site. Just pulled up to their command post. He's giving them the final details they need. Jake watched his grandmother absorb this last betrayal, seeing not defeat but a terrible resolve settle over her features. She looked at Thomas's photo one final time, then turned to the hidden systems her husband had entrusted only to her. You know what your grandfather said about harvest time? She asked quietly. He said sometimes you have to cut away what's damaged to save what matters. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced certainty. Time to show them what a real Wilson harvest looks like. Outside, the storm raged on, masking the sound of ancient machinery coming to life beneath the farm. Systems James had never known existed. Defenses even Jake hadn't suspected. The betrayal had changed everything, but not in the way their enemies expected. Margaret Wilson stood at her kitchen window, watching her son James direct the attackers around her farm's defenses. Each gesture he made betrayed another of Thomas's carefully planned protections. Each word into his radio stripped away another layer of their security. But Margaret wasn't watching her son anymore. She was watching her husband's last and greatest defense system slowly coming to life. Your father never understood what farming really means, she said to Jake, her voice steady despite everything. He saw crops and profits. Thomas saw deeper. He knew that farming isn't just about growing things. It's about protecting what matters, no matter the cost. Through their surveillance system, they watched James confidently leading a tactical team toward the house. He knew about the tunnels, the irrigation traps, the reinforced walls. But he didn't know about the last modification Thomas had made before his death. Your grandfather called it Protocol Zero, Margaret said, moving to a hidden panel beneath the kitchen sink. Said it was like burning a field to save the farm. A last resort. Jake studied the ancient control box, she revealed. What does it do? Thomas spent 30 years transforming this farm into a fortress. Margaret's hands moved across controls that looked like simple plumbing valves. But he built one final system to transform it into something else, something even family couldn't betray. Outside, James reached the front porch. His voice carried through their monitors. "Mom, it's over. You need to come out now. These men just want to talk business." Margaret's response was to turn the first valve. Deep beneath the farm, decades-old machinery groaned to life. "A farm protects its own," she said softly, echoing Thomas's words, "even from itself." The ground began to shift, not dramatically, but subtly, precisely engineered changes in the landscape that Thomas had spent years preparing. Escape routes became death traps, safe approaches turned treacherous, the very land seemed to turn against those who would take it by force. "My God," Jake whispered, watching the tactical displays. "The whole farm is one giant mechanism." "Your grandfather said every farmer needs to know when to start over." Margaret turned the second valve. "Sometimes that means burning everything down to save what matters most." Through their cameras, they watched James's confidence crumble as his carefully planned assault fell apart. The farm he thought he knew was transforming, becoming something else entirely. A maze of shifting terrain and false promises where every step could be the last. "Mom." James's voice held real fear now. "What's happening?" Margaret picked up the radio, her voice carrying the weight of 40 years of protection. "You forgot something, James. Something your father tried to teach. A farm isn't just land, it's a trust, a legacy, and some legacies can't be betrayed." She turned the final valve. The farm's ultimate defense protocol engaged fully, not with violence or destruction, but with the inexorable power of the land itself. Every hidden system Thomas had built, every secret modification, every carefully engineered feature activated simultaneously. The attackers found themselves trapped in a landscape that seemed alive, that fought back with all the cunning Thomas Wilson had poured into it over 3 decades. And at its heart stood Margaret, 93 years of strength and wisdom, protecting what mattered most. "Your grandfather's last gift," she told Jake as they watched the chaos unfold. He knew someday someone might try to take the farm by force, might even be family, so he made sure that if they did, the farm would fight back, Jake finished, understanding at last. Outside, in the storm-racked darkness, Thomas Wilson's final defense of his legacy played out exactly as he'd planned. Not with guns or violence, but with the power of the land itself, turned against those who would take it by force, guided by the hands of the woman who had helped build it. Margaret Wilson stood at her kitchen window, watching her son learn. The hardest lesson of all, that some betrayals carry their own consequences, and some legacies are stronger than blood. The farm's transformation was like watching 40 years of careful preparation unfold in minutes. Each system Thomas had hidden beneath innocent agricultural equipment activated in sequence, turning familiar ground into an engineered nightmare. And for the attackers, Eastern Sector activated, Jake reported from the command center. "Dad's team is cut off from their vehicles." Margaret nodded, her hands steady on controls that looked like irrigation regulators, but controlled so much more. Thomas based this system on something he saw in Korea, said sometimes the best defense is making the enemy question their own ground. Through their surveillance feeds, they watched James and his tactical team struggle with a landscape that seemed to shift under their feet. Drainage ditches became moats. Innocent-looking farm paths collapsed into carefully engineered trenches. Even the burned barn, which they'd been using as a rally point, began to sink into ground, softened by precisely directed water flow. "Mom!" James's voice crackled through their speakers. "This is insane! You have to stop this! Should have thought about insanity before you betrayed your father's legacy," Margaret replied calmly, activating another subsystem. "A farm remembers, James, and so do I." Sarah's voice cut through their communications. "Multiple targets retreating. Southwest. They're trying to reach their backup vehicles. Let them run." Jake advised, but Margaret shook her head. Your grandfather planned for retreat too. She turned what looked like an ancient thermostat dial. Remember how he always said a good harvest depends on proper field rotation? The retreating attackers suddenly found their escape route transformed. The seemingly solid ground beneath their feet became a quagmire. Decades of careful soil preparation, creating terrain that could be turned to mud with the flip of a switch. My God, Jake whispered, watching the tactical displays. Every field, every path, he turned the whole farm into one giant trap. Not a trap, Margaret corrected. A choice. Everyone who comes here has one. Respect the land or learn why they should have. Through the storm-lashed windows, they watched James's team fracture. Professional operators used to controlling their environment found themselves in a landscape that actively fought against them. Every tactic they tried was countered by systems laid decades ago by a farmer who'd understood that sometimes the best defense is the land itself. Final warning, Mum. James's voice held desperation now. Ramirez won't stop. He'll bring in more men, heavier equipment. Let him. Margaret's voice carried all the strength of her years defending this land. Your father spent 30 years preparing this farm for exactly that kind of fight. Did you really think he wouldn't plan for everything? She reached for the last control panel, hidden behind Thomas's old barometer. Time to show them what a Wilson farm can really do. The storm intensified, as if nature itself was aligning with their defense. And beneath the rain-soaked earth, Thomas Wilson's ultimate legacy began to awaken. The real harvest was about to begin. Ramirez arrived as the storm reached its peak, his black SUV cutting through the rain like a shark through dark water. Through their monitors, Margaret and Jake watched him step out, his expensive suit soaked instantly as he surveyed the chaos. Their defenses had created. So this is the famous Mrs. Wilson, his voice carried through their surveillance system. The old woman who thinks she can stop progress. He turned to James, who stood dripping and defeated nearby. You said this would be easy. It should have been, James protested. I told you everything I know about the farm's defenses. Everything you knew, Margaret corrected through their external speakers. Your father understood something you never did, James. A farm keeps its deepest secrets for those who truly love it. Ramirez's response was to pull out his phone, making a call that brought immediate results. Within minutes, more vehicles appeared through the storm. Heavy equipment, professional operators, the kind of force that could overwhelm any normal defense. Last chance, Mrs. Wilson, Ramirez called out. You've impressed us, I admit it, but this ends tonight, one way or another. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, where she'd watched 40 years of storms roll across her land. Her fingers traced Thomas's old combat medals, displayed in their simple frame. You know what your grandfather said the night before he died? She asked Jake softly. He said a soldier fights for his country, but a farmer fights for something more personal, the land itself. Through their cameras, they watched Ramirez's men begin unloading serious equipment. Cutting tools, breaching charges, earth movers. They'll try to overwhelm the farm's defenses through sheer force, Jake analyzed. We should fall back, regroup. No. Margaret's voice held iron certainty. Your grandfather didn't build this place to fall back. He built it to stand. She moved to the command center's main console, her movements precise despite her age. One by one, she began activating systems Jake hadn't even known existed. Deep beneath the farm, machinery that had waited decades hummed to life. Thomas called this the harvest protocol, she explained, as ancient gears began to turn. Said sometimes you have to be willing to sacrifice everything to save what matters most. Outside, Ramirez's men were advancing with professional confidence. Their heavy equipment making steady progress despite the farm's defensive measures. But Margaret wasn't watching them. Her eyes were on the rain. Your grandfather taught me that farming isn't just about growing things, she said, her hands moving across controls that looked like simple farm equipment but were anything but. It's about understanding cycles, patterns, knowing when to plant, when to wait, her eyes hardened, and when to reap. The storm's intensity seemed to increase with each activation sequence. Lightning revealed glimpses of Ramirez's men, still advancing, but now showing signs of uncertainty. The ground beneath their feet had begun to change in ways their equipment couldn't explain. They think they're fighting an old woman and her soldier. "Grandson," Margaret's voice carried 40 years of quiet strength. "They're about to learn they're fighting something much older, much deeper." Sarah's voice crackled through their radio. "Multiple breaching teams in position. They're preparing for a coordinated assault." Jake checked their defensive readouts, his tactical mind processing options. But Margaret seemed almost calm now, watching the storm through her window like she had so many times before. "Your grandfather said every farm has 3 harvests," she told Jake. "The one everyone sees, the one only farmers know about." She turned the final control, activating Thomas Wilson's ultimate defense protocol, and the one you pray you never have to bring in. The farm's transformation accelerated. Not just the mechanical defenses now, but something more fundamental. The very land itself seemed to wake up, responding to 40 years of careful preparation. "Mom," James's voice carried desperation. "Whatever you're doing, stop. You don't understand what these people are capable of." "No, James," Margaret replied softly. "They don't understand what this land is capable of. But they're about to learn." Thunder crashed overhead as Ramirez gave the order to begin their final assault. His men moved forward with professional precision, their equipment ready to overcome any normal defense. But the Wilson farm had never been normal. And Margaret Wilson had spent 40 years learning every secret her husband had built. Into it, the harvest was about to begin. The Wilson farm's final transformation began with a sound like ancient machinery awakening. Deep beneath the rain-soaked earth, 30 years of Thomas Wilson's engineering came to life. Not with violence or explosions, but with the inexorable power of the land itself. "My God," Jake breathed, watching the tactical displays. "The whole farm is moving. Each field, each carefully graded slope, each innocuous drainage ditch became part of a massive integrated defense system. The land seemed to ripple, decades of precise soil preparation and hidden mechanisms, creating an environment that actively fought against the intruders. Ramirez's men found their heavy equipment sinking into ground that had suddenly become unstable. Professional operators watched in disbelief as their tactical advantages disappeared into terrain that shifted and changed with every step. "What the hell is this?" Ramirez's voice crackled through their surveillance. "James, you said nothing about this." "I didn't know," James shouted back, his voice carrying genuine fear now. "Dad never— This isn't possible." Margaret's hands moved across Thomas's control panels with practiced certainty. "Your father designed this system based on something he saw in Korea," she told Jake. "Said sometimes the best defense isn't what you build above ground, but what you prepare below it." The farm's transformation accelerated. Hidden cisterns, disguised as irrigation reservoirs, released their contents in precisely calculated patterns. The seemingly random arrangement of fields and pastures revealed itself as an interlocked series of defensive zones, each one channeling attackers exactly where Margaret wanted them. "Eastern team is stuck," Sarah reported. "Western team trying to use their cutting equipment, but—" She paused, amazed. "The ground keeps shifting. They can't get stable footing." Through their cameras, they watched Ramirez's professional operation dissolve into chaos. Men who had overcome military and police defenses found themselves helpless, against a farm that seemed alive, that turned their every tactic against them. "The barn," James's voice carried warning. "We can still use the high ground." The burn structure chose that moment to complete its calculated collapse, its framework giving way along paths Thomas had engineered decades ago, not falling randomly, but folding in on itself, creating new barriers exactly where they were needed. Your grandfather spent 30 years planning this, Margaret said quietly. Every improvement, every repair, every modification, all building toward this moment. A farm that could protect itself. Ramirez, his expensive suit now caked with mud, grabbed his radio. "Bring in the excavators. We'll dig this place apart if we have to." "I wouldn't," Margaret's voice carried across their external speakers. "Those vibrations you're feeling, that's 30 years of careful soil preparation coming alive. Every machine you bring in just makes it worse." As if to prove her point, the ground beneath their heaviest equipment suddenly liquefied, turning solid earth into quicksand. Decades of layered soil composition, precisely engineered drainage systems, and carefully hidden mechanisms worked in concert to create terrain that was literally impossible to fight against. "Mom, please." James's desperation was clear now. "People are going to die, only if they keep trying to take what isn't theirs." Margaret's response was implacable. "A farm defends its own, James. Your father understood that. Why didn't you?" Jake watched in amazement as his grandmother orchestrated the farm's defense with the same calm precision she used for planting seasons. Each activation sequence, each carefully timed release of water or shift of earth was like a harvest brought in with mechanical perfection. Ramirez's men, professionals who had overcome military and police defenses worldwide, found themselves defeated not by force or firepower, but by a farm that turned their every move against them. Their equipment useless in terrain that wouldn't stay solid. Their tactics meaningless against defenses that changed faster than they could adapt. "Fall back!" Ramirez finally ordered. "Everyone fall back to—" But there was nowhere to fall back to. The farm had become a maze of shifting ground and impossible terrain, each retreat route leading deeper into prepared killing zones where the land itself was their enemy. Through it all, Margaret Wilson stood at her kitchen window, watching the storm rage across the land she'd protected for 40 years. Her hands moved across her husband's controls with the same surety she'd once used to bring in harvest, each action precise, each outcome calculated. "A farm isn't just land," she said softly, echoing Thomas's words. "It's a promise, a legacy, and some legacies can't be broken." The storm reached its peak as the farm's final defenses activated. 30 years of preparation, of hidden work disguised as routine maintenance, of a veteran's tactical genius merged with a farmer's patience, all coming together in one unstoppable demonstration of the land's power. And at its center stood Margaret Wilson, 93 years of strength and wisdom, protecting what mattered most in exactly the way her husband had planned. The harvest was almost complete. The storm began to ease as dawn approached, revealing the full extent of the Wilson farm's transformation. Ramirez's professional force was scattered, their equipment useless, their tactical advantage destroyed by a defense system 30 years in the making. But the final confrontation wasn't about force or firepower. It came down to family. James Wilson stood alone on his mother's porch, soaked and defeated, while Ramirez's remaining men retreated into the lightening sky. Through the window, Margaret watched her son, the boy who'd never understood what the farm truly meant, now facing the full weight of his choices. "It's over, James," she said through the door. "Time to come home." "Home?" His laugh was bitter. "This place was never home to me. It was Dad's obsession, your prison. I was trying to free you by selling us out to criminals." Jake's voice was hard. "By betraying everything Grandpa built?" "Built?" James turned, anger and hurt mixing in his voice. "He built a fortress, spent 30 years turning a farm into a weapon. For what? What kind of man does that instead of being there for his family? A man who understood what family really means." Margaret opened the door, facing her son directly. "Your father didn't build this place as a weapon, James. He built it as a promise." She stepped onto the porch, her movements still graceful despite everything. Every system, every defense, every hidden feature. They weren't about keeping people out. They were about protecting what matters most. The land, James scoffed. The legacy, Margaret corrected. Not just the farm, but what it represents. The strength to protect what you love, the patience to build something lasting, the wisdom to know what's worth fighting for. Dawn's first real light broke through the clouds, illuminating the transformed landscape. Where Ramirez's men had seen weapons and traps, Margaret saw Thomas's love made manifest. 30 years of careful work designed to ensure his family would always have a home they could defend. Your father knew he was sick, Margaret continued softly. Knew he wouldn't be here to protect us himself. So he poured everything he had, his military training, his engineering skill, his farmer's wisdom, into making sure we could protect ourselves. Understanding finally dawned in James's eyes. The systems, the defenses, they weren't about paranoia. They were about love, Jake finished, joining them on the porch. Everything Grandpa built, every secret he engineered into this place, it was all to make sure his family would always have a home they could keep safe. James looked out over the farm, seeing it truly for the first time. Not just land and buildings, but a physical manifestation of his father's devotion. Each hidden defense, each careful preparation was a father's determination to protect his family even after he was gone. I never understood, he whispered. All those times Dad tried to teach me about the farm, I thought he was choosing it over us. He was teaching you how to protect what matters, Margaret said gently. The same way he taught Jake, the same way he taught me. A farm isn't just land, James. It's a trust, a legacy, something worth defending. The sun broke fully over the horizon, revealing the Wilson farm in all its transformed glory. The land that had seemed so ordinary yesterday now stood as testament to one man's love and foresight, protected by the woman who had helped build it and the grandson who had understood its true purpose. Come inside, Margaret said to her son. It's time you learned what your father was really trying to teach you. As the new day dawned, the Wilson farm began its slow return to normal. But it would never be quite the same. Like the family that worked it, it had been transformed, not just by its hidden defenses, but by the revelation of its true purpose. A legacy of love, written in earth and steel, protected by 3 generations of Wilsons who finally understood what it meant to be farmers in the deepest sense of the word, guardians of not just land, but of something far more precious, home. A week after the storm, the Wilson farm showed little sign of its transformation. The land had settled back into its familiar patterns, Thomas's systems once again hidden beneath innocent agricultural fixtures. Only those who knew where to look could see the subtle signs of the farm's true nature. Margaret sat on her porch, watching Jake and James work together to rebuild the barn. The father and son had spent the week learning what Thomas had tried to teach them all along, that a farm's strength lies not in its secrets, but in the family that protects it. They're using Grandpa's original plans, Jake reported during a water break. Found features we never knew about. The man thought of everything. He had good reason, Margaret smiled, scratching Mac's ears as the old dog dozed beside her chair. Your grandfather believed the best legacy isn't what you leave behind, but what you teach others to carry forward. Ramirez and his men had disappeared, their defeat at the hands of an elderly farmer and her family's legacy spreading through certain circles. The Wilson farm had gained a reputation, not as a fortress or a weapon, but as something more fundamental, a testament to the lengths good people will go to protect what matters. Sarah Chen still drove by daily, but her patrols had become social visits. The young deputy had gained a deeper appreciation for the quiet strength that ran through their rural community. Your father would be proud, Margaret told James that evening as they sat around the kitchen table. Not of the farm's defenses, but of what they protected: family, home, the things that matter most. The farm's secrets remained largely hidden, known only to those who had earned the right to share them. But its greatest secret, the power of legacy and love, stood revealed in the strengthened bonds between 3 generations of Wilsons. As summer faded into autumn, Margaret Wilson continued her daily routines, tending her crops and animals with the same care she gave to maintaining Thomas's hidden systems. The farm remained what it had always been, a working piece of land that fed both body and soul. But now it was something more, a symbol of what can be accomplished when love and determination are given time to grow, when a family's legacy is measured not in acres or yields, but in the strength of its bonds and the depth of its roots. Thomas Wilson had built more than defenses into his farm. He had built a future, one that would be protected not just by hidden mechanisms and clever engineering, but by the understanding he had tried to pass on to his family. That the greatest strength lies not in walls or weapons, but in the hearts of those who stand together to protect what they love. The Wilson farm endured, as it always had, not just as a piece of land, but as a living testament to one family's understanding of what it truly means to be farmers, protectors, and keepers of a legacy that would outlast them all.